Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. You know, it's an honor to be among a group of America-loving patriots like all of you. You have guts and you've got conviction. You know, it's inspiring to look out on a crowd like this. When I was walking around the hall earlier today, I saw families, I saw parents and grandparents, young women, professionals, teenagers, hunters and sportsmen, members of law enforcement. NRA members come from every single walk of life, every race, every creed. And I am proud to be a lifetime NRA member and to stand with all of you. Listen, America is struggling right now, and there are those who want to change our foundational way of life. And then there are those of us who value the gift that we were given by the founders of this great republic. The test of time has proven that this greatest experiment in human history, called the United States of America, is truly the only government that guarantees an individual's liberties and freedoms. Now, our hearts are broken at the tragedy that we saw this week here in Texas. And as a mother and a grandmother, I can't even imagine what the families of those dear children and those teachers are going through. I hope that you are all lifting them up in prayer. And sadly, it's not the first time that we've experienced this type of grief. I think all of us here today and across the country never want to see anything like this ever happen again. But we have very many difficult questions that we have to answer today. This isn't the time for grandstanding. It's not the time for shouting or division. This is the time to be honest, to work together to protect the future for our children and our grandchildren. To truly decide where we are going as a country, we need to reflect on our history and look back at where we've been. Here are some of those questions. Why was the Second Amendment even created? Does it still hold value today? Why is it okay for some to have guns and others not? Why do we protect our banks, our stores, and celebrities with armed guards but not our children? Are they not truly our greatest treasure? Much, much more valuable than material things? If we limit the average citizen from having a firearm, will that keep those who choose to ignore the law from accessing one as well? Listen, I don't have all the answers for you today, but I do want to share with you why I believe the Second Amendment may be the most important of our Bill of Rights. Now, the Second Amendment is sacred to me and to our family. It always has been. And able to understand why it's so important to us, you need to know a little bit about me personally. Growing up on a farm in South Dakota, guns were just a fact of life for my family. My dad was a farmer and a rancher, a real-life cowboy who worked harder than anybody I had ever known. He was tough as rawhide. He lived a life of integrity, and he expected his children to embrace those ideals. Of course, this also applied to our firearms. Owning guns wasn't a political thing for us. Like most American families, we rarely discussed government or politics around the table. On our ranch, our politics were lived, not talked about. We knew we had freedom and we had personal responsibility, but we also knew that we needed to use both to make our corner of the world a better place to serve other people. It wasn't complicated. Before I was old enough to get my own hunting license, I used to follow my grandmother when she was out bird hunting. And yes, in South Dakota, even our grandmas are armed. Now, my dad, he preferred big game hunting, and from a young age, my siblings and I, we went with him. We had guns hanging in the back window of every pickup. Our gun cabinet was proudly displayed in our living room. Firearms were woven into the fabric of our day. We grew up educated about guns and hunting. And as much as I love hunting, the Second Amendment isn't about any of that. The Second Amendment is about deterrence. It's about ensuring government respects the rights and the liberty of citizens. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Those 27 words are freedom's last line of defense. The founders understood deeply that without an armed citizenry, authentic freedom could not and would not survive. Now, how did they know this? What were their circumstances? What did they know about human nature and the temptation to seize power? Did they know how fragile freedom could be? What were they drawing on? Well, number one, they were drawing on their own experience. The founders knew that the country would have never survived the Revolutionary War if the colonists hadn't owned their own weapons. Look at Boston in 1775. 11,000 expertly trained British soldiers occupied the city, and George Washington's ragtag army of Continentals surrounded them. His American volunteers carried only their personal muskets. They used these to hold the British at bay until a 25-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox could retrieve 60 tons of artillery and move it more than 300 miles to help. In the meantime, the Continentals challenged the infantry of the British Empire with the same firearms that they used to hunt squirrels and deer and to feed their families. Now, what else did the founding generation understand? They knew human nature. Writing in 1775, Thomas Paine laid it out clearly. While avarice and ambition have a place in the heart of man, the weak will become prey to the strong. The history of every age and nation establishes these truths, and facts need but little arguments when they prove themselves. When I read about the Constitution, I'm often struck by the subject and the issue of timing. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were ratified effective December 15th, 1791. But what else was happening in the world at that time? The French Revolution. Unlike the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the foundational document of the French Revolution, does not include a right to bear arms. And Thomas Paine's arguments proved themselves in horrifying detail. In Paris, which was the center of European learning and culture for 1,000 years, mobs tore down statues and crosses. Does that sound familiar? They attacked religion. They desecrated churches. The mob consumed French society until a dictator could arise from all the chaos. Our founding fathers were watching these horrors take place elsewhere in the world. One Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitutional Convention wrote the following to the Philadelphia Federal Gazette in 1789. He wrote, "Civil rulers may attempt to tyrannize, and the military forces which must be occasionally raised to defend our country might pervert their power to the injury of their fellow citizens." Does this mean that at the time the Constitution was ratified, the founders might have been worried about a corrupt American government using the military to crush the rights of regular citizens? It sure sounds that way, doesn't it? So let's talk about the cities with the most restrictive gun control laws. When 30 people are shot over a weekend in Chicago, we get nothing but silence from Joe Biden and the media. When gang members kill innocent children in Baltimore or Cleveland, they might give it a passing mention on the local news. But when a deranged, mentally unstable murderer who fits the left's political narrative kills innocent children and people, the media seizes the opportunity to paint millions of law-abiding gun owners and you and me as barbarians, monsters. People like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi instantly start calling for more gun laws that wouldn't have made any difference in stopping the shooter. They use the tragic situation to push their agenda, and it is all about control, and it is garbage. I'm not buying it for a second, and you shouldn't either. George Mason warned, "To disarm the people is the most effectual way to enslave them." The pandemic showed us that freedom is just as fragile in our time as it was in 1775. Now, fortunately, more Americans are waking up to this. From 2020 to 2021, around 11 million people in this country purchased a firearm for the very first time. About half of them were women. And almost 60% of them were over the age of 45. I believe the number one reason was because of fear of civil unrest and to protect themselves and their families. We have seen the same type of radical mob mentality taking place on the streets of American cities that swept Paris in the 1790s. Woke mobs are tearing down statues, and it doesn't matter who they are of. Our founding fathers, Catholic missionaries, they even wanted to come after Mount Rushmore. Well, not on my watch. On cue, the left and their media allies cheered them on. Remember when Chris Cuomo was asking where in the Constitution it says protests have to be peaceful? Well, it's in the first sentence, in the First Amendment, Chris. Look it up. Of course. Now, Americans were horrified. We have an incredible opportunity in front of us, but we also have a challenge. We need to find, educate, and persuade these Americans of why the Second Amendment is so vitally important. I mentioned that I grew up surrounded by guns on a farm and a ranch, but it was only later that I learned firearms have an essential role in sustaining our political freedom here at home. And we need to help others understand that role too. We need to be smart in how we reach out to them. We should anchor ourselves in history and our present-day trials. Just saying, oh, the founders said this, so we should do it too, is just not good enough. They need to know why. The enemies of freedom have always tried to disarm patriots, which is why we have to engage today. We know this isn't something new in human history, and because of that, we can anticipate the challenges. We need to act with confidence and with courage. We need to take action. Now, the very first bill that I signed upon taking office as governor in 2018 was constitutional carry. Not only did I sign the bill, I held a signing ceremony in the rotunda of the Capitol to demonstrate the importance of the legislation. But I wasn't done, so this year I advocated for and signed legislation that repeals all concealed carry permit fees in South Dakota, and the state is even going to pay for your federal background check. It will not cost you a penny to exercise your Second Amendment constitutional rights in South Dakota. We also clarified South Dakota's Stand Your Ground law by establishing that the burden of proof, by clear and convincing evidence, lies on the parties seeking to overcome the immunity provided under this law. You have a right in South Dakota to protect yourself and your family. We updated the definition of loaded firearm to designate that a firearm is considered loaded only if a round is chambered. This makes it easier to store unloaded firearms while still letting you defend yourself in situations when seconds matter. When it comes to the Second Amendment, South Dakota is leading, and other states should follow our lead. Now is not the time to cave to the woke culture. Let me tell you the truth about the enemies of the Second Amendment. They are schooled in the ways of Marx and Lenin. They play the long game. They are content with chipping away at your rights. 50 years, 100 years, they are deceptive and they are patient. They count on Americans to tire of the fight, to eventually relinquish our freedoms and our rights. We saw it during the pandemic. Too many of our fellow citizens freely handed over their rights to work or to even leave their home until a corrupt government gave them the green light to do so. Well, not in South Dakota. We were the only state that never once shut down a single business or closed churches. Our children came through the pandemic with the least amount of learning loss of any in the country, and we are leading the country in educational outcomes. We gave our citizens We gave our citizens the best information. We let them use personal responsibility to make the best decisions for themselves and for their families. You know, freedom. I clearly told the people of South Dakota what I was doing to solve the problem. My friends could see it, and so could my opponents. And that's what this community must do now. We need to be very clear about what the Second Amendment is really about and why we advocate for it. This position is not going to make you popular with the liberals who want to restrict your freedom. They will attack you. We see it every single day. I get attacked every day in the media. I have two things to say about that. First, you get the most flack when you're over the target. If they're attacking you, it's because you're doing something effective that scares them. So keep it up. Second, stay tough. To paraphrase Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, you can't go wobbly on this. All right? I was recently reading a history of General Grant. He had a powerful reflection from early in the Civil War that I think is relevant for us in the gun rights community. In one of his earliest battles, the young Colonel Grant was leading his regiment against an enemy position. He was suddenly aware and felt an all-consuming fear. Fear that he would fail. Fear that he was going to get killed. Fear that he was going to get all of his men killed. And when his men finally came up over the rise, they saw that the Confederate position was empty, that they had deserted. The opposing colonel had been every bit as afraid of Grant as Grant had been of him. He didn't have the stomach for the battle, so he had turned tail and he had ran. Here's what Grant wrote of that event. From that event to the close of the war, I never once experienced trepidation upon confronting an enemy again. Though I always felt more or less anxiety, I never forgot that he had as much reason to fear my forces as I had of his. The left likes to appear monolithic, unstoppable, but it's not. And what's more, the left is afraid of the NRA. They fear people who think for themselves and who defend their rights. There are so many people out there that are counting on us to help them defend their right. So don't back down. Now is not the time to quit. Now would be the worst time to quit. Now is when we double down. Lastly, what does it look like when a person embraces their fundamental rights and responsibilities? I think it's clear that they become more free. They become more capable, more independent, more powerful, more free. We are all called to live courageously in the battlefield of our daily lives. Our workplaces, our communities, our homes, our country needs it. No weak-willed or half measures will save us from the relentless and the unhinged radicals that we are facing today. So we double down. This fight is much bigger than the people in this room. The consequences of our actions will affect all future generations of Americans. Do you want your children to have the same freedom that we've been blessed with? Do you want your grandchildren to understand and to know and experience liberty? Then we must protect the Second Amendment. It is an honor. It is an honor to be in the trenches with each of you, and that's why I'm proud to be here today. So thank you for your work. God bless you, and may God continue to bless the great United States of America.